Okay, up next, we've got Dre Carl talking about a fishery response to the lake trout daily bag limit reduction.
Thanks, Corey, for the intro. Thanks to the committee for the opportunity to talk about this, getting more applied management evaluations here compared to the last few talks. But this is an analysis that I worked on over the past few months with my colleagues Chris Zunker and Brad Ray from the Wisconsin DNR, as well as Mike Sider from the Fish and Wildlife Service. And essentially, it's what happened to the recreational fishery as a whole following daily bag limit reduction of lake trout in WI2 or the Apostle Islands region of Lake Superior. But to start off, I kind of want to share a story of what gave me the inspiration to look into some of this stuff. It's my very first summer, 2019, working for Wisconsin DNR. Fresh out of school, moved up to Lake Superior, and I was not, a Great Lakes person before this job. But a new friend of mine offered to take me lake trout fishing for the first time. We're going to go to Saxon Harbor. For those that aren't familiar, Saxon Harbor is right on the boundary of the Wisconsin-Michigan boundary. So we're heading to the harbor. It's a beautiful day. I'm about to go lake trout fishing. I'm happy. But then my friend looked across the truck from me and asked, "Did you remember to get your Michigan fishing license?" I said, "Why would I have gotten my Michigan license? We're Wisconsin residents. Obviously, we're going to be fishing Wisconsin waters." And he says to me, "Well, the bag limit is 3 over there and only 2 in Wisconsin, so I figured we'd fish Michigan." And ultimately, despite being straight out of school and broke, I paid the extra license fee. But it just did get me wondering what aspects of the fishery, other than just how many you may be able to keep during a day of fishing, what other aspects may have been affected by the bag reduction. So what do we know about bag limits? Just really briefly, they're usually intended to help provide a ceiling for exploitation or some sort of limit, or just distribute that harvest over more anglers. But 2 common themes usually pop up in fisheries research, and that's bag limit reductions don't always lead to harvest reductions, and regulation changes in general tend to cause unexpected shifts in angler behavior. And for this talk, we're going to be, again, focusing on Management Unit WI2, Lake Trout, Apostle Islands region, and ultimately how we got to this point of a bag reduction. So we observed quite a steep drop in spawning stock biomass from about 2009 to 2015. And during that time, we were reactively decreasing quotas of all fisheries in the region, but on the recreational side, by 2015, we're actually approaching that point where we were probably going to be bumping up next to the recreational allotment of the quota, where in the past, that just hadn't been an issue. And if we do approach that quota before the end of the regular fishing season, that forces us to close the season early. That is not an outcome that is really liked by the angling public in our area. So we decided to reduce the bag limits from 3 to 2 in hopes to really spread out the harvest or reduce the rate at which we approach the quota to help prevent early season closures. So a specific reg history of WI2, we're going to be looking at this analysis for at least 7 years of data from 2008 to 2014 under a 3 bag, and 7 years from 2017 to 2023 under a 2 bag. And both of these regulation periods had a common 1/25 inch regulation. Our objectives, pretty much to compare the entire recreational fishery before and after that bag reduction, and specifically look at 2 sectors, the private sector and the charter sector. Private being those individually regular licensed anglers, and the charter being the separate license that you have to get for guided trips. So there are guides. Different metrics we looked at are the probability of harvesting a full bag as an angling party, a harvest rate for lake trout, fish per angler hour, length at harvest, and effort dynamics broken down into its individual components being pressure or trips, trip duration, party size, and angler hours per trip. So Wisconsin waters of Lake Superior are bisected into 2 management units, which lends itself very well to a Bakke experimental design, before-after control impact, where we have WI2 with the bag reduction, WI1, which remain unchanged at the 3-bag limit, served as the control. These black dots represent a fishery independent spring gillnetting survey for lake trout. So we're going to be incorporating indices independent of the fishery into this analysis. Concurrently, we conducted a creel survey, 6 different bus routes, compiling over 22,000 interviews and over 9,000 pressure counts. And then we utilized our mandatory charter harvest reporting database, which had over 5,000 trips. And like I mentioned, we're going to be comparing region to region in that Bakke design, but we're also interested in how these effort dynamics could have differed from a regional scale to those ports that are right next to the borders. So we looked at it as a zoomed-in scale, using just the border ports, and utilizing the Michigan side on the eastern border, which also was left unchanged at the 3-bag limit during this time frame. Generalized linear mixed effects model, random factors were a year, month, and the creel survey site, with the addition of day type, weekend, or weekday for the angler pressure models. Fixed effects, the regulation period, whether it's before or after that bag reduction, the treatment, whether it got the reduction or not, and then that interaction of those two. And that's what we test in the Bakke design to determine whether there was a bag limit effect. And we recovered the E-means, the estimated marginal means, to look at the magnitude of these differences, if there were any. Going to get into the results in the very next slide, but this is how they're going to be laid out in each one. Going to be moving from the 3-bag period to the 2-bag period, moving left to right, and the E-mean of whatever response on the y-axis. WI2 with the bag reduction is always going to be the green circles with the solid line, and WI1, the control, always going to be in the yellow triangles, dotted lines. So first, looking at the probability of filling your bag as an angling party. In the private fishery, we did see a significant increase following the bag reduction in WI2 of the probability of filling your bag, from a magnitude of about 5% to 18%. And you can see in the 2-bag period, it didn't really separate from the control all that much. However, in the charter fishery, we saw a substantial increase in the probability of filling your bag, from about 18% to 42%. And it really separated itself in the 2-bag period from the control. So overall, significant increases in that probability, but more pronounced in the charter fishery for sure. Now getting to the lake trout harvest rate. Remember, this is kind of our ultimate goal of this regulation change, reducing the rate at which we approach that recreational quota. But first, to put that harvest rate kind of into context of how many fish are available, looked at the Fishery Independent Survey CPUE. And we did see a significant increase in the number of lake trout available in WI2 compared to a decrease of lake trout available to the fishery in WI1 over that time period. So if the bag limit change didn't really have an effect on harvest rates, you'd expect the harvest rates to pretty much align with how many fish are out there. That's exactly what we saw in the private fishery, an increase in the harvest rate after a bag limit reduction. Kind of the opposite of what you would have thought. However, in the charter fishery, we saw harvest rate decrease a little in MWI2 after the bag reduction, and that similar decrease in the control. So we were pretty confident in concluding that harvest rates were dampened in WI2 in the charter fishery, but not in the private fishery. Okay, moving on to effort. These 4 different effort dynamics for the private fishery at a regional scale. First, the pressure and number of trips, and we saw a pretty consistent increase in the pressure in both WI2 and the control. Didn't seem to be influenced by the bag reduction. However, we did see a decrease in the mean trip duration in WI2 compared to the control. Pretty logical response. A few extra parties bagging out a little bit early, ending their fishing trips a little bit earlier. But we also heard anecdotally that many anglers were less willing to commit the resources like fuel to travel further away distances for only 2 fish. So next we actually saw an increase in the number of anglers per party, which is very interesting. So basically when it came down to it, anglers simply chose to bring an extra buddy along to help avoid that bag limit reduction. And lastly here, those 2 things, a decreasing trip duration, increasing anglers per party, met a net unchanged effort per trip in terms of angler hours. Okay, the same 4 effort dynamics, but zoomed into the borders. This time, the biggest difference here is we saw a substantial decrease of pressure in WI2 at the borders compared to the control. So indicating anglers fishing near those borders were actively avoiding the bag limit reduction by just fishing in the neighboring management units. So similar to the regional comparison, we also saw a slightly reduced trip duration. Unlike the regional comparison, did not observe a difference in the number of anglers per party. So suggesting to avoid the bag reduction, anglers fishing near the border were more likely to turn right or left to the neighboring management unit rather than bring that extra buddy along. Again, no change in effort per trip, even at the borders. What about the charter fishing effort dynamics? I'm going to save you the suspense. None of these trends had a significant bag limit effect. So we did see some increasing and decreasing trends in these metrics like pressure, increasing pressure, decreasing trip duration, and decreasing effort per trip. However, these were very directly reflected in our control fishery. So we did conclude that these changes likely happened independent of the bag reduction. Kind of more or less probably reflecting overall shifts in the charter fishing industry itself. Last results, mean size of lake trout. First looking at the survey, Fishery Independent Survey, reflecting hopefully what's available for harvest. And we saw similar declines in mean length of both WI2 and the control over this time period. However, length at harvest from harvested fish in the creel survey, we saw a significant increase in the size of lake trout harvested in WI2. It was a slight change, only about 10 millimeters potentially, but likely an effect of the bag reduction. And as a reminder, that common 1/25" reg between both bag limits. Overall, we did observe a set of about 3 responses that were intended or somewhat intended at least. First, a bag limit reduction from 3 to 2 did increase the probability of bagging out in both fisheries, but it was much more pronounced in the charter fishery. The harvest rate was dampened in the charter fishery, but not the private fishery, so our overall goal of reducing that harvest rate in the recreational fishery to reduce chances of early season closures was somewhat partially achieved, I'd say. And lastly, we did not see any noticeable effects of the bag limit change to effort in the charter fishery. However, as is the case, as I kind of hinted at the beginning, we did see some unintended responses to the private fishery, specifically after the bag reduction. The first being that angler pressure was displaced from WI2 into the neighboring management units, specifically at ports near the borders. Angling party size increased, which paired with the reduced trip duration offset any changes of effort per trip. And we did observe slightly larger sizes of lake trout harvested after the bag reduction. And so I've kind of narrowed all this down to 3 of the bigger takeaways for management, at least in our opinions. First, the bag limit changes will likely have the biggest impacts on harvest of high efficiency fisheries, for example, our charter fishery. And the truth of the matter is, myself, and sounds like Fritz earlier, we're just not very good anglers in general in the private industry. And that bag reduction just it had a minimal effect. However, despite no reduction in harvest rate in the private fishery, anglers altered their fishing behavior. So just the perception of a bag limit reduction tempted anglers into bringing an extra person on board, or if you're planning on fishing near the border in the first place, might as well just fish in the neighboring management unit. And lastly, that displacement of effort between jurisdictions should certainly be considered when changing regulations in the future. WI2 has relatively low fishing effort near the borders, but looking at a circumstance such as in the future for Wisconsin-Minnesota boundary, which is right outside the Twin Ports, biggest population center in Lake Superior, you would expect that magnitude of an effect to be larger. So with that, I'll be happy to try to answer any questions.